Welcome on this session on the evaluation of frameworks by funders to assess the impact of funding, which is part of the Global Research Council virtual conference on responsible research assessment. In this session, I will start this by giving a short introduction of the panel. I will give a short introduction of the topics and challenges that we are facing on the assessment of funding instruments. And then after my short introduction, where I will describe the challenges that we are facing, I will give the floor to 4 members of the panel, which will give will address this issue from various topics of ranging from experience in the past based on the European Commission by Nelly Bruno, by Professor Erika Kramer-Mbulo from South Africa, and Carlos Enrique de Brito Cruz, who was former scientific director of Sao Paulo Foundation for Research, and who now is vice president of Elsevier Research Networks. And I think it's very interesting to also have some input from publishers who are very active in this field, developing data analytics tools to assess the impact of research. And then finally, we have Gonietta Jones, who's Vice President of Research of Michael Smith Foundation in Canada. So let me start by describing the scene of this meeting. Knowledge has become very important. We're talking about a knowledge society, and that's because many governments consider the results of research as very important for their economy. It then can deal with research focusing on public-private partnerships together with industry, but I think research is equally important to have a vital, flexible, and healthy society. Talking about research, we have to find a question that is often addressed is, what is the right balance between basic blue sky research and research focusing on societal challenges and public-private partnership? The issue is that, in my opinion, there is an increasing focus on performance-based research. And the reason is that money provided by the government, tends to have a specific purpose in general, where politicians want to have an impact on a relatively short term, whereas basic research has an impact on the long term. And so we're talking about different funding schemes for basic research, addressing societal challenges or public-private partnerships, since each funding instrument has a different purpose. Typically, there are different requirements, part of the call for proposals in each of these instruments. And we have seen a variety of funding instruments, at least within Europe, where there's an increasing complexity due to requirements that are attached to different funding schemes. Now, what's at stake? I just mentioned society and taxpayers, they request a return on investment. And that's a hard question. Several studies, international studies, have shown that investments by industry typically have a high return on investment. It's also generally accepted that investments in the hardcore sciences like physics, chemistry, mathematics have in return of investment which really in general exceeds the investment by far. What is way harder to decide is the return of investment on research in the social sciences and humanities. I'm not saying that there is no investment. I firmly believe there is, but it's hard to decide how to measure. And research councils, we have our funding instruments to promote basic research, to promote blue sky research. And it's our job to show what the effectiveness is of our funding instruments, and also what the impact on science and society. And I just mentioned, I think there's a pressure uh, on curiosity-driven blue sky research because um, typically thematic research has a short-term impact, and that's why blue sky research is often vulnerable to any cuts, or if you have to make a decision between the two. Um, in general, the preference will be on thematic research. But in my view, curiosity-driven research and thematic research are two sides of the same coin. Now, the point is that the evaluation of the effectiveness of funding instruments is quite complex for various reasons. First of all, it's hard to quantify the impact of research and the return of investments of research. And the same is true, I think, to measure the contribution or the impact of the specific funding instruments that are used by funders. Another reason is that the impact of projects funded by funders typically have an impact which takes 5 years or more. And if you talk about curiosity-driven research, blue sky research, the impact comes way longer. And that means that measuring the impact means that you have to follow the project, and even when the grant expires, you have to monitor and evaluate the results of publications, patents, and who is going to use the results for a long time, 10, 20 years sometimes. And quite different from research, control experiments by funders are hard to do. So in my view, this means that in order to evaluate the effectiveness of funding instruments and their impact requires an international collaboration. So my point is that I think a joint effort by many funders for monitoring and evaluation of comparable research funding instruments is quite important. And I really want to mention the aspect that we should not compare apples and pears, but if we work together, we should focus on funding instruments, for example, for blue sky research. Every funder has a special program for basic research, blue sky research. Or we might compare funding instruments for public-private partnerships, but we should compare the proper instruments. And by working together, I think there are several issues that are at stake. We have to find agreement about the criteria that we use to evaluate funding programs and to evaluate impact. We have to decide about the key performance indicators to measure impact. By working together, we have more data, and by more data allows you to make more specific conclusions. And we have to compare different constraints. If I compare the instruments by the Dutch Science Foundation with those of the German Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, we both have programs for basic research, but we have some slight different constraints. And I think by working together, we might learn about the effect of these constraints and decide what are the best. And by working together, we might exchange our best practices. So the challenge is, how can we design proper funding instruments? How should we evaluate them? There's a theory of change, which focuses on the methodology, planning, monitoring, and evaluation of results. How to measure impact of funding instruments is the impact pathways approach. Is that a useful one? We should find common key performance indicators as criteria for monitoring and evaluation. How to exchange data between funders, and that's quite difficult. I mean, we have persistent identifiers for researchers. They can think about the ORCIDs, output, but we also should have persistent identifiers for funders, for funding mechanisms for our grants, so that we can compare grants and give a follow-up for a long time. We have to talk, if we collaborate different countries, we have to how to deal with confounding factors, different cultures, difference in economy. Differences in the balance between private and public funding. Think about the United States. Typically, universities have a huge private funding, and the funding by the government is relatively small. That's quite different in Germany and the Netherlands. And talking about collaboration between funders, what to think about uh, collaboration with publishers? Um, Publishers also have invested quite a lot in data analytics, and they can help funders in addressing issues about the impact of their funding instruments. And if so, if we do that, under what conditions? Obviously, we shouldn't have a vendor lock-in, but we should allow all interested private partners. So this is a short introduction uh, on the question on the evaluation of funding instruments. And I'm happy that we have 4 experts on these topics from different continents who are willing to give their view based on their experience. And the first in this panel is Professor Erika Kramer-Mbula, professor at the Center of Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology, University of Stellenbosch at South Africa. So may I give the floor to you?
Good day, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this panel. My name is Erika Kramer-Mbula, and I am a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, where I lead a research chair in transformative innovation, the fourth industrial revolution, and sustainable development. I will focus my remarks today on research excellence, what it means and how this concept is applied in the context of the Global South, particularly in Africa. My remarks are largely drawn from a collaboration across researchers and research funders engaged in discussions that started about 3 years ago, emerging from the work of the Science Granting Council's initiative supported by IDRC, and that resulted in a book that was published earlier this year called Transforming Research Excellence: New Ideas from the Global South. I will not be able to cover the rich discussions that are contained in this book in this short amount of time, but I will just reflect on some of them. There is a global aspiration for researchers and science organizations to become excellent. The concept of excellence is well established in many fields of activity, and the term is used frequently to refer to outstanding performance. Excellence is often related to reputation and standing, but more importantly, excellence is a central consideration when it comes to the allocation of funding. In other words, it determines what gets funded and what doesn't. As the term gains ground, one would expect to have a clearly measurable definition of excellence that can be applied objectively to make decisions around funding, for instance. Unfortunately, this is not the case. In fact, the very notion of excellence is highly contested when it comes to articulating what should be counted as excellence and why that is. The concept of excellence appeals to superior standards, and usually the scientific community agrees that it's important to differentiate between the best and the rest. But some may argue that excellence is about the process, while others argue that excellence is about the outcomes, and the former doesn't automatically translate into the latter. In other words, research that may be excellent in its process, in terms of being rigorous, robust, or methodologically sound, may not automatically translate into broader social and economic impacts, for instance. Another point of contestation has to do with whose notion of excellence is embedded in its definition, and some may speak of research excellence referring to the values of the scientific community, while others prefer to broaden the notion of excellence to include broader societal values. Lastly, there is a time and space consideration and contestation. So what may count as excellent now may not be count as excellent in the future, and the same with the context. What counts as excellent in one place may not be excellent in another. So some of these points of contestation are reflected in the discussions pertaining the application of the concept in the Global South that I referred to earlier in our recent book. Researchers in the Global South, and this speaks particularly to the context of Africa, operate under severe constraints. Some of them are captured in a study that I conducted with my colleague Professor Tyson in 2017, where we captured the perceptions of various African researchers in a number of disciplines and fields of science. And the most frequently challenge that was mentioned in terms of achieving research excellence was insufficient funding. The continent has a general lack of funding, and this permeates to the working environment of African scientists. This is followed by poor research infrastructure and equipment, heavy teaching loads, which result in African scientists having insufficient time often to dedicate to research activities, the lack of skills and human resources and research capabilities, and poor access to top-rated journals, among others. But one may argue that supporting excellent research in the African context may be essential, and this has to do with various things. One of them is the demographics. Having the youngest population in the planet, it makes intellectual investment imperative. Nurturing talent becomes essential. The need to find solutions to complex and persistent issues having to do with health, poverty, climate change adaptation, energy solutions. This requires interdisciplinary research informed and conducted with a range of stakeholders. In fact, we're talking about transdisciplinary research. However, when measured against the bar of number of publications in high-rated journals and international citations, African scholars seem to be negatively affected, and it puts them at the low end. There are various difficulties that have to do with the cost of publishing, the systematic bias in the peer review process, sees negatively researchers coming from less known institutions or laboratories. The lower representation of African researchers as peer reviewers in highly rated journals, as well as language barriers, result in failure of African research to become internationally visible, and sometimes fails to be published altogether. So in response to these challenges, which relate not only to Africa, but are visible across the Global South, our book proposes a few broad recommendations. And I won't go through all of them, but I will just summarize a few. Firstly, we shouldn't take the concept of research excellence for granted. We need to be transparent in its definition, and this definition must either be precise and tailored to context or avoided altogether. While there may be advantages in ensuring that extraordinary research is provided with adequate funding to continue to make important contributions to science, it may be even more important to focus efforts on strengthening research ecosystems. Focusing on systems may prevent reproducing the existence of islands of excellence that may be disconnected from each other and often disconnected from the society in which they exist. And thirdly, excellence is pluralistic and should be used to recognize diverse forms of scholarship. This implies enabling different forms of high quality knowledge to be produced through different methodologies and in different languages and formats. And having this pluralistic view of excellence would not only help develop better solutions that are tailored to the context, but also will help researchers from the Global South to be better recognized not only globally, but locally, but internationally. So in summary, in our book, we see this as the time for dedicated leadership to either move beyond or to reclaim the concept of research excellence in the Global South and globally. Thank you for listening.
The next speaker in our panel is Nelly Bruno, Team Leader, Program Analysis and Evaluation of the European Commission. Nelly, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you. I will try to see how I manage to because now I'm a bit up. Yes, so thank you very much, Stan. So I'm working in the European Commission in the service dealing with research and innovation, with the Research and Innovation Framework Program. I'm working on the evaluation and analysis of this program since now more than 5 years. And before that, I used to be an evaluator in the private sector, evaluating national, regional, or international policies and programs on research and innovation. So in case you don't know the European Framework Programme for Research and Innovation, it exists since more than 35 years. Currently, it has a budget of more than 80 billion euros over 7 years, and it involves research teams from around the world. We need, as was already mentioned by Stan in his introduction, we need to evaluate this program to know what's happening. Why do we need to evaluate these programs? Because we have the better regulation framework in the European Commission that asks us to evaluate every action we do to ensure that we deliver maximum performance and value added. So we have to deliver on accountability objectives, so ensure that we deliver value for money. We need also to evaluate our programs for advocacy reasons. When we have to make budgetary arbitrations, we need to show that research and innovation investments matter. And we also need to evaluate to be able to learn and improve our programs. So the better regulation agenda applies over the whole policy cycle. So from the development of the program at the time of the impact assessment, then at the moment of implementation, so the monitoring activities, and then for the evaluations of the program, which are typically happening at the midterm and then upon completion of the program. Of course, as was said before as well, evaluating research and innovation is not straightforward. We are facing complexity in this domain. In particular, we know that there is a question of uncertainty and risks. So we don't want to discourage risk-taking in research and innovation activities. We also need to know when to evaluate, because there is a question of time that is very important in evaluation. We shouldn't evaluate too early. We should allow time to pass, but still we need to be able to say what's happening. So we need to still have some signals. And a third point that is very important, that was also hinted by Stan in his presentation, is a question of attribution and contribution. How can we know that what we observe is due to our investments, or is it due to other elements of the context, to other research projects that are ongoing, or to the overall evolution of the scientific and technological environment? On this slide, you can see an example of what we did for the interim evaluation of the current program, Horizon 2020. We had to perform this evaluation after 3 years of implementation. So we tried to face this complexity and to still come with some messages that would be useful for policy learning. To do that, we reconstructed the intervention logic of the program, and what we saw since the start of these framework programs 35 years ago, we have scientific, societal, and economic impacts. Whatever the instruments we use, overall, over a very long time frame, this is really the impacts that always come out of our investments. So this is the structure that we use for the evaluation of the program. We knew we couldn't go too far in terms of reporting on impact, but we could already identify what is driving or hindering progress. So what would not allow us to deliver what we want if we don't act upon it. It can be in terms of the way we implement our program, if we manage to reach out to the beneficiaries in all countries, in the right settings, etc. And in terms of analyzing what's happening, we also try to use a lot of qualitative data, case studies, to really try to dig into what's happening beyond just the data. So the key performance indicators, because we had a lot of difficulties as well to have quality data available for the whole program that we could aggregate. So all these points are detailed in the evaluation of the program if you want to dig deeper. But what we learned from this exercise is that we really needed to find a way to improve our monitoring system, to be able to have more information on the go, a quality information. So we came out of this exercise with a proposal for the future programs that will start in 2021. where we try to reconcile these policy needs of advocacy, accountability, and learning with the challenges we have for the measurement of impact. So the new program, Horizon Europe, it has different types of objectives which relate to the scientific, societal, and economic impact. So what we try to do with the development of these 9 key impact pathways that you can see here is to identify on what we need to have information. It doesn't mean that all projects that we will fund through the program will deliver on all these pathways, but here we identify, we anticipate the key information needs on which we want to have information to be able to report and communicate on the go. So in terms of scientific impact, it relates to the quality of science we perform. It also relates to the reinforcement of human capital because we have also many mobility schemes in the program. It also links to the diffusion of knowledge and the open access practices. We also have all the classical indicators on the growth, jobs, and the leveraging investments through the program. So all of this is quite demanded by policymakers, indeed. And then we have these elements related to the societal impact. Societal impact is something that is very new in terms of measurement, and we don't have methodologies available for that. So now we are currently trying to experiment and test different methodologies to capture the impact of our projects, for instance, on climate, on environment, on health, on energy consumption, etc. For this, we try to see what is available experience from different parts of the programs that we could maybe put forward for the whole program. But we also try to rely a lot more on text analysis, semantic analysis, while for the scientific and economic impact, we also try to work a lot more with microdata. So for us, it's very important to be able to identify the researchers that we have in our projects, to have an increased use of unique identifiers, including for the outputs of the research, for instance, to have a funder ID in the publications. It's something that is very important to be able to track impact in the longer term as well. So beyond the completion of the project, if we manage to have more microdata, we can know more about what's happening without having to go back to the beneficiaries to ask them. So for each pathway, we have a storyline, so what we would like to see happening from the program, and then we have time-dependent indicators. So through these indicators, we want to manage expectations on what could be reported when. So for instance, we don't want to report on jobs created after 1 year. It makes no sense. We are not going to report on citations of publications after 1 year. We really want to be able to start reporting on data when it makes sense. So this is the overall framework for the monitoring of the program. So this is a backbone of the monitoring system that will then feed into more informed evaluation of the program. So here, just as a concluding slide, you see how we will implement this evidence-based analysis across the whole program for the whole policy cycle. So we start with this impact assessment that we did for Horizon Europe, where we designed the intervention logic and the impact framework, where we try to anticipate evidence needs, what could be the indicators and the data sources, where we push a lot more for the use of microdata and unique identifiers, which are crucial for us to be able to know the trajectories of our beneficiaries, but also of the non-beneficiaries. So we can also build control groups from the start to see what's happening in specific disciplines for the ones that participate to our program, compared to the ones that would benefit from only national schemes or the international schemes. Then during the implementation of the program, we will have a continuous monitoring along the key impact pathways, but also for the management and implementation data relating to funding, participation, etc. And we'll try to identify early on what we can act to be able to reach impact we want if there are already difficulties on the go. And then we also have these monitoring flashes that we already have now and that you can find online, where we identify in terms of monitoring data what we can already see and what could be relevant to act upon during the lifetime of the program. With all of this, we want to have better informed evaluations. It's also very important to have the evaluations at the right time, as I said. So for us, we make it very clear in the new regulation of the program that the interim evaluation of the program will not look at the effectiveness and the impact of the program after 3 years, but will rely on the longer term impacts of the past programs. So we have to build on the history and on the years of investments of the program. So we have to be also very realistic on what we can capture when. So after 3 years, we can look at implementation, we can look at the coherence between instruments, but we will not be able to report on the impact of the current program, but we can report on the past. So with this, I gave you an overview of what we are doing, and I will be happy to answer any question you might have. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Nelly, about your presentation, about your experience in with the European Commission on evaluating the effectiveness of European programs. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Carlos Henrique de Brito Cruz, formerly associated to the Sao Paulo Research Foundation in Brazil, FAPESP, but now Senior Vice President of Elsevier Research Networks. Carlos, please.
Thank you very much, Stan, for the invitation to participate in this very, very interesting session. And I'll try and share my slides here. Should be there. And so what I want to do here is in these few minutes, describe a little bit of how we have been working at the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, in Brazil, with developing impact, assessing impact, and demonstrating impact of the research that we fund. And I should say that Stan's presentation and Nelly's presentation help a lot what I have to present, because we face the same type of challenges as were described by them, which I kind of summarize by the idea that the taxpayer has now less patience than they used to have 30 years ago, with the idea that good science is going to bring good things at some point in the future. The taxpayers' representatives, which would be the politicians, ask from the funding bodies many more questions, and questions which are more pointed about, okay, when is that the benefit is going to come? What is the benefit going to be? And that comes here in Brazil as part of I believe, the evolution of democracy in Brazil, which creates a natural dispute or a natural discussion in the legislative branch and in the executive branch about how to best allocate the scarce resources that the state or the government has to create benefits for the population. So their questions must be recognized as legitimate questions, and it incumbes on the research funding body to create the convincing answers or convincing explanations about those questions around impact and benefits. So the way we tend to think about impact at the São Paulo Research Foundation is in 3 dimensions, which very much are similar to one of the slides Nelly just presented. One of the dimensions is what we call intellectual impact, which is the impact of ideas by themselves. We like to describe this as the search for ideas that help to make humankind wiser, without regard to what is the use of those ideas. They make us wiser, and that should be enough for this dimension. Then there is another dimension, which would be that one of social impact, which would relate to ideas that increase well-being, assist or inform public policy, and increase the benefit from public goods. Those are normally ideas that cannot be privately appropriated. So, for example, when a hospital learns or develops a new procedure that will make treatment more efficient or more efficacious, that is something that benefits everyone, but it's not a given that that hospital is going to make more money out of having a better procedure. And the third dimension that we deal with, which tends to be the most popular one, especially among politicians, is that one of economic impact, which relates to ideas that create new businesses, create jobs, develop the economy, and those tend to be easier to measure because then you can measure how many startup companies were created, how many patents were licensed, did the companies grow and create more jobs, and so on. But those are three dimensions which should not be, and we never at FAPESP have the expectation that the three dimensions will be present in each one of the projects that we fund. We would like to see those three dimensions being fulfilled by the system of projects that we fund. So we have some projects which are much stronger in intellectual impact. Others are stronger in economic impact, and others in social impact, and a few in the three dimensions or in two of those dimensions. The way we work at FAPESP involves one initiative or one type of initiative, which Stan mentioned in his initial presentation, which was or still is, the creation of special programs for funding research in which we make the connection to impact more visible from the start. That is, the São Paulo Research Foundation has a strong program of what would be called research-driven research, which is researcher-driven research, which are projects in which the PIs choose a topic, they submit a proposal, they actually can do that here without deadlines, they can submit any day they want, and the foundation analyzes the proposal. That uses about 70 to 75% of the foundation's money. Training, fellowships for students, and so on. And on top of that, the foundation has been, since 1994, creating special programs to target certain impacts which we learned from interactions with the legislative branch or the executive branch that were relevant for the state of São Paulo. For example, we have a set of sector-oriented programs in which we fund, for example, research in collaboration between university and industry, in which industry co-funds part of the cost of the research. Its most recent addition is long-term 10-year engineering research centers, which have not only applied research, but a substantial portion of exploratory basic research, which is allowed because of the long-term duration of those centers. Then we have a special program that funds research in collaboration between university and government that relates mostly to public policy, for example, environmental policy, tax or fiscal policy, health policy. So we associate researchers with practitioners to perform research which will lead to improvements in those specific policies. And we also created a special program on research in small business, which funds every workday grant is approved for a small business in the state of São Paulo to perform research to develop new products or new processes, a very successful program. Then another type of special program are those associated with themes or topics. For example, a set of researchers who are going to deal with genomics or biodiversity or neuroscience, fast internet, bioenergy. For example, our bioenergy program congregates now more than 300 PIs, thousands of students. Global change, 100 PIs, hundreds of students, and other topics. And then research which is oriented towards higher scientific impact, especially through long-term grants, 5 years or 11-year centers, or young investigator awards, which are very similar to the ERC starting grants. We also implemented cross-program initiatives which affect all of those and the Blue Sky research programs through international and national collaboration, through the support of research infrastructure, and through the improvement of the way research is organized in the state of São Paulo, with a manual of good practices in research and with research management requirements from each one of the projects. And of course, each one of those programs is evaluated in terms of program, not in terms of individual projects. The individual projects are evaluated in a different way, but they are evaluated through surveys, control groups, data, cases, several instruments that we use, which look at the quality of program implementation and program impact. Program impact assessment at FAPESP is normally done by an external team of researchers from which we select proposals which will look into each one of the programs considering the fulfillment of the program objectives. So they are measured against what the foundation stated the foundation wanted to obtain from those programs. And they also look at the quality of the implementation of the program. It's the outputs of the program are internal detailed reports, which are used by the foundation to improve each one of the programs, publications that contribute to the international debate on program evaluation, and also data. Data is especially useful for policy and budget debates because most of the time, politicians and executive branch authorities, they do not have a long time to listen. You tell them for 20 minutes about one specific project. So most of the time, data can help us to put everything in a number of indicators and show them that there is progress or that there is no progress that should be changed and so on. Those are described at this website about evaluation. Examples of conclusions in those evaluations. For example, the evaluation of our small business innovative research program found that companies mobilize $11 for each dollar granted by FAPESP, which is a very good return on investment. It also demonstrated that 85% of the grants use knowledge from universities and research institutes in the small business. And it also demonstrated that the companies funded by FAPESP see a 60% increase in the number of jobs for graduates, masters or PhDs after the project is done. It's not with the money funded by FAPESP. It is 3, 4, 5 years after the project was completed. Those are described in this publication in Research Evaluation. And for example, for the Graduate Fellowships program, our main training program at FAPESP, they found that students supported by FAPESP tend to publish more after graduation. They obtain better paid jobs 5 years after graduation, again described in this reference which is mentioned at the screen. One example of using data which has been very effective for us is this type of measurement. In Brazil, there has been for a long time a debate about university industry interaction, as there is in many other countries. The thing is that here in Brazil, there were no indicators to show if the interaction was growing or not growing, or enough or not enough. People just talked about the interaction without having any measurement about that. And one of the measurements that we used using data from Scopus database is this data about the number of articles which have co-authors in a university in the state of São Paulo and a company in Brazil or elsewhere in the world, showing that you can see this very, very strong growth, which is actually an exponential growth starting in 1990, which is a good way to demonstrate to the taxpayer, to the politicians, that there is more interaction each year. It's not that there is no interaction. Then the discussion changed to, okay, how much interaction there is and how can you make that even stronger? And the interaction is with companies like the ones listed there, Petrobras, Fleury, Embraer, which are Brazilian companies, or IBM from the US, paper mills, energy and chemistry and health companies and so on. And then you can also measure how the system is oriented towards certain themes and certain topics. And as a result, for example, those are 3 figures just from this year from big newspapers in Brazil dealing or describing this result. And they are in Portuguese. That's your chance of learning some Portuguese. But what they say there is that universities are unjustly criticized. So it defends the idea that the universities are making progress. It also shows here that interaction between university and business in Brazil is underestimated, which again is something relevant to know if you want to develop policies for that. And here it states that scientific production gains when there are partnerships between universities and companies. So this is one illustration of how you can get good taxpayer visibility using data that measures the impact of research and that translates that in a simple way for people to understand. So I'll finish by repeating this, that we consider those 3 dimensions, intellectual, social, and economic impact, and by insisting that we do not expect each one of the projects that we have to fulfill those 3 dimensions, but we expect and we look and we work towards having the system of projects that FAPESP support attend more and more to those 3 dimensions of impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno, for your nice, excellent presentation. It was quite interesting to see how you measure impact of funding by FAPESP. Also, interesting to see how that you may also measure the results of additional jobs that are the result of public investments. And it very nicely agrees with results that we have done in the Netherlands, where we have shown that public investments elicit additional private funding. Our politicians were afraid that by adding additional public money, that would diminish the private funding, but our results show that giving additional public funding just stimulates, it enhances the investments by private parties. So thank you very much. The next presentation is by Gonetja Jones, who is Vice President Research at the Michael Smith Foundation of Health Research at Canada. Gonetja, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you, Stan. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you. And delighted to be here and participate in this really fascinating discussion on assessing the impact of research. Again, I am Vice President of Research at the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research, and I appreciate that many people in the audience will not have heard of us. So just very quickly, Michael Smith Foundation is British Columbia's health research funding agency. We were founded after the Nobel laureate, Dr. Michael Smith, a preeminent chemist and molecular biologist, and we're funded by the government of British Columbia. We work with provincial and federal partners to support 4 pillars of health research: biomedical research, clinical research, population health, health services, and health policy. Furthermore, Michael Smith is committed to ensuring that the knowledge produced from research informs decisions on health policy and practice that will benefit patients and the public at large. But for the purposes of this panel discussion, I'm not going to present the views of any single funder. Rather, I'm going to take a slightly different approach than my esteemed colleagues that have preceded me. My comments are going to draw from 2 decades of experience in science and health research in different international settings, and from my work with major private charitable foundations in the US, UK, and Canada that support research. So as research funders, we hold ourselves accountable for demonstrating the value of research from discovery research through to research that has the potential to yield outcomes that benefit society. And there's clearly a place for evaluating the effectiveness and the outputs of funding instruments or funding programs, provide accountability, as we've heard, and the assurance of further investments in research. In my experience, focusing on evaluation on funding programs gives a narrow view of how well a research portfolio is performing, and it does not answer key strategic questions that sit at the top of an organization. For example, what assurance do we have that our funding programs are collectively effective toward achieving our strategic objectives? How do we make the best use of our resources and allocate them appropriately across all of our funding programs and activities? How can we make funding commitments on appropriate time horizons that are needed for achieving outcomes, while also responding flexibly to emerging challenges and new opportunities? How do we incorporate new information and change course in a changing context or landscape? And how do we evaluate success relative to where the program or activity sits along the continuum from research to impact? That is, irrespective of whether there will be an immediate impact or the potential to yield benefits to society later in the future. And again, we've heard about this from the previous panelists. So there are well-established methods for evaluating impact at the program level. And I'm not going to go into this because you've heard about some really great methods and approaches. I'm going to take this opportunity to share 4 insights that have stayed with me over the course of experience of evaluating research in over a decade. And the first insight that I will share is to take a portfolio-wide view and evaluate the outcomes or impact of research relative to where it sits on a continuum. As we all know, research to impact is not a linear pathway, and we've heard that what success looks like for basic or discovery research looks very different from research that has an explicit intent to improve policy and practice. Discovery research advances knowledge or supports talent or tries to gain understanding of a question or a problem, whereas research that is explicitly intended to improve socioeconomic or health outcomes produces evidence that informs decisions in policy or practice. So where we ask researchers to demonstrate a causal link between their research that we've funded and societal incomes, there's a risk that that stifles creativity and innovation. And it ignores the fact that research has the greatest potential to yield outputs that can benefit society because it builds on a body of research. And that's really key here. And that's why a portfolio level view brings an additional insight that's different to program. Furthermore, what success looks like for evaluating curiosity-driven research looks quite different from what success looks like for challenge or directed research. That is, the latter is research that is designed to achieve an outcome and often tries to address a complex problem or a big societal challenge. So the advice that I would offer is to deploy a range of methods. There's no single method or approach for assessing the effectiveness of funding strategies. That includes program level evaluation based on what the funding program is trying to achieve, but also at a portfolio level based on what the overall strategic objectives might be. The second insight I would offer is research is not static and predictable, and neither should evaluation frameworks be static and predictable. The definition of impact doesn't have the same meaning in different contexts, across disciplines, sectors, or even countries. There's no single or even multiple reliable measures of impact. And so the use of static evaluation frameworks is becoming outdated, and it yields limited insights on how well funding portfolios are performing. Rather, evaluation frameworks must be able to capture the unanticipated outputs or outcomes of research. And so the advice I would offer is to adopt agile evaluation and learning frameworks where the primary driver is learning. And this includes in consulting stakeholders, both allies and skeptics, for constructive challenge that can inform how well a portfolio is performing. The third insight I would offer is that funders should take more direct responsibility for achieving the impact. Conventionally, the burden is placed on researchers to demonstrate the impact of the research, and therefore our evaluation methods and tools and approaches look at researchers and those outputs, those projects, the program level. But contributing to researchers or projects or program success are also the funder's responsibility, not only the direct input like funding and policies, but the indirect input like mobilizing networks, convening in advocacy, working in partnership with others, government partners, industrial partners, private actors, research institutions to create an enabling environment for research. So the advice I would offer is to invite external independent evaluation that looks at both the effectiveness and the impacts of a program, as well as the funder's strategies and policies, and assess both the funder's direct and indirect contributions to impact. And the last insight I would offer is that funders should seek evidence to inform and transform their practice. And that very much speaks to what the chair's opening comments. Research funders should regularly and critically reflect on what research we fund, but how it was funded to maximize the potential to benefit society. There is no consensus on best practice in research funding. There is little evidence of how research funders can support research and innovation in multiple contexts. And there's little understanding of what works for whom and under what circumstances. So the last advice I would offer is to make funding processes and decisions transparent. Share not only funder data, but implicit information, which drives funder practice and policies and promotes shared learning across funders in different contexts. This allows us to assess whether both the funding instruments are fit for purpose and to match the intent and impact. And so while at Wellcome Trust in the UK, I co-founded the Research on Research Institute, or RORI. And this is an international consortium of research funders, publishers, academics, professional societies, technologists that have come together to champion transformative and translational research on research. What this means is not only to exchange formal data and policies, but also implicit practices, and to develop new tools, indicators, and evaluation frameworks looking across the activities and the objectives of multiple funders. In addition to that, importantly, is to conduct experiments that advance the understanding of how well our funding instruments, our objectives are being met, and how we can contribute to more effective, open, and inclusive research systems. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Juanita, for your perspective from a quite different view about the portfolio-wide view. And also thank you for mentioning the link to RORI, the Research on Research Institute, which was established, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, which I think is a very interesting approach to addressing the topic that we have on the table today. Okay, now I think this is a proper time to have to open for the discussion. I will have a question to Nelly. When you mentioned the work that you have done for European Commission, how could you tell something about the effort that you invest for the evaluation? How much manpower, how much budget do you invest in order to have reliable results?
So you mean for the evaluation of the current program?
Yeah.
So yeah, we learn from experience, and I think this is also a key point mentioned by Juanita. I think we invested a lot for the evaluations of the programs in the past, mainly because we had uncoordinated approaches. And for us, it's very important to be able to start from our objectives and to have an holistic approach. So we invested quite a lot of energy and resources for the interim evaluation of Horizon 2020 because the approach was not coordinated from the start. There were different data sources, different methodologies used to analyze data. But now we are trying to improve the situation for the future. So that's why we start from, so we try to anticipate the needs from the start. So it requires a very long-term planning in terms of identifying the right data sources. But if we manage to work more with microdata, I think we can really simplify a lot for the beneficiaries in terms of reporting, but also on our hand. Indeed, now there is a lot of evolution in terms of digitization, access to data. Also the publishers, as you say, now have a lot of information in terms of when you look at the publication data sets, for instance, you can look at disciplines as research organizations. You can analyze many things more simply. So yeah, so it was a lot of resources, but we're trying to make it more coordinated. But I also think it's worth it because it's really a big learning exercise. And as was also said, we also involve a lot of stakeholders in these processes. This is part of the better regulation framework. We need to consult stakeholders. And this is very important for us to be able also to have evaluation results that are pick up and that actually influence the implementation of the program in the future. I don't want to take too much time. But,
okay, yeah. So it's obvious what you're saying. I think it really requires some effort, which is another reason I think for funders to work together in order to have insight on impact of.
Yeah, but planning is very important, and I think now it's true that we can start from the beginning as well to see if we can have also some control groups and some panel data to be able to compare. Okay. And if you speak about cooperation between research organizations, I think this is a key element. If we want to look at the mobility of researchers across the world, if you want to see if we are supporting young researchers to build up their career, to have better working conditions, I think this is a way for us forward to try to work a bit more together, to also have maybe common researchers' profiles or CVs, so they don't have to repeat the same information again and again. Yeah. And the quality of the data is also improving.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions from other panel members?
I have a question to Konechia, which is that how did I say your name correctly?
Almost. It's Chonetta. They would thank you
Chonetta.
for
Okay. Chonetta. Sorry about that. So my question is, you mentioned at some point the fact that the balance in your portfolio might be dynamic. It's not static. And that brings to me the thinking that the evaluation of the portfolio must happen while the projects are happening and not after they are finished. Would you comment on that?
No, I think that's a really interesting question and observation. I think both, and you're right. So there's a sense that you're trying to collect information in real time. Even for program evaluations, oftentimes those happen at a stage after you've already made the decision whether you're going to continue or do something else, right? So I think the attractive kind of model that I think is taking hold in a lot of and being used by different funders is a model that, as I mentioned, is an adaptive model. It uses many of the same approaches, methods, measures, but it reduces that number down to kind of critical information that you can collect systematically in real time, but you're basically tracking progress against strategic objectives. So I would say yes, taking a portfolio view is happening in real time alongside a program that's running. And at the program level, of course, you're asking different questions. So I would say that's true, but there's value also in retrospective evaluation of a portfolio also, because like many funders, we think we're supporting research or we've got a vision to support research. And then once we actually run our instruments and our mechanisms, our different models, and we go back and said, was that actually what we expected? For example, research-led ideas or competition types of mechanisms, are often the diversity of the applications, the pool are often driven by the people who come to us. And so sometimes as a funder, we may have the intent to support a certain type of research or around a particular problem, but what we actually see that we funded tends to be different than that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carlos, do you have any other questions?
I have Sure. Well, I have many questions.
Okay.
My other question would be to Nelly about this idea. It's about something that we have been considering for some time here in Brazil, and then now at Elsevier, which is the idea, if you, what would be your thoughts on that, of connecting grants to their articles, which is what everybody does, and then going some steps further. You connect in technology the articles to the patents that cited the articles. And then you look at what happened to the patents, how valuable they are, or if you are in a health field, how many drugs that went into trials came from those patents. Is this something that you consider at the European Commission?
Yes, this is really at the core of our thinking, because what we see from past evaluations that we know a lot about the outputs from the projects, because this is what's happening in the duration of the project. And then we don't know much about the next destinations. So you can have publications or patent applications, but then we don't necessarily go to the next steps. But where we make a difference, for instance, in terms of environmental impact, is when someone is actually using the product that is on the market. And for now, this is very difficult to go to that stage. Even the licensing from patents is something that is not easy to capture, or the citations of publications in patents, etc. So there is a long way. And what we want to set in place is a system that would allow us to still follow this way after the projects are over since a very long time. It's not easy. And we know there are some data mining techniques that are being developed now to maybe do some company web, the web scraping of company websites, for instance, to see if there are trademarks, for instance, to be able to track it more. And I think evaluation approaches will also need to evolve with this new method that would allow us to see a bit on the longer term. And ideally, we would be able to see what happened from our investments from 10 years ago to see what's happening now. But yeah, we need to set the right systems in place to be able to capture that. And this is what we expect. But of course, we need to also leave space for the unexpected. And this is very important, that even if we want to have scientific impact from, for instance, ERC grants that you mentioned, that we also allow to be able to capture if they have an impact on climate, for instance, so that we can also capture this. We shouldn't be so segmented in our thinking. But yeah, all of this is very challenging, but for us, it's very important to also face this complexity and try to find some pragmatic approaches to still be able to say what's happening in the projects.
A challenge in this approach is that the time lag can be enormous, right? It could be 20 years between a grant and a drug that comes from that idea.
Can I just offer a suggestion? Is that there is similar to what was just described, a web scraping tool that Wellcome Trust developed called the Reach tool. And while at Wellcome, I did use this, and we were able to track outputs of research, Wellcome funded research, 10, 15, 20 years later. So it's, there's some really interesting data, science technology that's being deployed. And so I would, and so this is an open source tool. So I would encourage you to have a look.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well, this brings us to the end of this session. I think we should have to provide some time for the Q&A that's following up with the live. So thank you very much, my panel members, for your contribution. Very interesting. And I hope this will be food for thought in the upcoming sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues.
Bye.
Bye.
Presentation on Tuesday this week. And this is the Q&A on sessions on with questions on session 7. And before we start, I would like to shortly introduce to you Erika Kremambula from South Africa, Carlos Henrique de Brito Cruz from Brazil, Nelly Bruno from the European Commission, and Sonyetia Jones from Canada. Okay, we are ready to take your questions. So, Catherine, could you please take over and give the first questions to us?
Yes, the first question is around about definitions of impact. So how broad are your definitions of impact? And then how are these positive impacts taken into account in evaluation of future research?
Okay, I think, well, in general, we take impact quite broad, but we have to I think we should interpret the impact depending on what you're talking about. If you talk the impact of a particular project, or are we talking about the impact of a particular funding program? Are we talking about the impact of a funding agency? So of course, depending on what your questions, we give a different answer. But at the end of your question, I think you're explicitly mentioning education. And if I remember correctly, Carlos, you did some analysis on the impact of, if I remember correctly, PhD students. So could you tell a little bit on that? You are muted, Carl.
I'm on now.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll be happy to do that, Stan. But the way we dealt with impact at the São Paulo Research Foundation, to make it easier for us to understand it, to communicate both to the researchers and to the general community, was to discuss impact thinking about 3 dimensions of impact. One of them would be economic impact. That's normally the most popular one. The politicians tend to like it because they can count that in terms of jobs created, companies that grew, and so on. So there's economic impact. There's a second one, which is social impact, which are ideas created by research that benefit people, but are harder to be appropriated privately. So for example, in a hospital, people discover ways to better treat a disease like they discovered now with the COVID. That improves the lives of people, but it doesn't result in a patent or many times not even a scientific article. So those are, again, ideas that have social impact and which are very relevant. And the third dimension that we worked with is a dimension we use it to call intellectual or scientific, which are those ideas that help to create more ideas in the future. We used to call those the ideas that make mankind wiser. They might not be ideas that create companies or heal people, but they are relevant ideas, like, for example, how the universe started, the theory of relativity, evolution, whatever, ideas. So the key thing, and I'll finish here my answer because it's getting to be too long, is that we always use those 3 dimensions to assess a system, not to assess each one of the scientists and not even each one of the institutions. Because our view is that what the taxpayer expects from a research system as a whole, funders, universities, research institutes, companies, are those 3 things: economic, social, and intellectual. And then you use that to assess the system or to assess our full portfolio. And in the portfolio, there will be research which contributes only or in a very major way to making mankind wiser. And there will be others that create companies that in 2 years will be $1 billion companies and so on. So 3 dimensions: economic, social, and intellectual.
Anyone else from the panel who want to respond to that, or to add to that? Yeah, Janitja, please.
Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant answer, Carlos. Thank you. And I would have absolutely agreed. I would, in terms of, really thinking about impact in its broadest sense. And then also really from a funder perspective, really kind of raising it to that next level and looking at it from a portfolio level. The only thing I was going to say is, kind of really in response to the latter part of the question. So when we do that, how does that actually influence the decisions that we make in terms of allocation of funding and so forth? And, I would say it's a lot more complicated than that. I think we consider a lot of factors. The assessment of how our portfolios are performing is only one part of that decision making. Really, there's other strategic drivers. We have portfolios that are mixed. Some are very much discovery-led, curiosity-led, whereas others we are, really interested in achieving a particular outcome that might be challenge-led, for example. So I think it looks quite different depending upon what our strategic objectives might be. But what I will say is really helpful when we do these types of assessments is that it does give us insight back into, did what we expect to achieve through this particular program or this investment or this instrument collectively, did it add the value that we thought it was going to? And I think that's really, really important. Evaluating programs or projects at that level really, in my view, speaks to accountability. Of course, we have to be accountable. But funders, in terms of how we make decisions and allocate our funding and resources, we have to look at the totality of all of our investments. And it's not as always obvious, I think, to people outside of the organization. But again, I think, Carlos, that was a brilliant answer, because it's exactly how I would suggest that funders should be thinking.
Thank you. Erica, you want to add to that?
Thanks. Yes, I fully agree with everything that has been said and mentioned. I would like to add perhaps another dimension of impact that could be considered. I mean, it's about the impact of the research outputs themselves, but also perhaps about the process of research. In this sense, we can think about impact in terms of participation and diversity. Inclusion, is the research conducted in an inclusive way? Does it take into account broader participation from minorities, from women, from perhaps disadvantaged communities? What is the level of engagement with the users and beneficiaries? And all of these aspects related to the process of research may also give us some clues about important dimensions of impact that we may want to consider. Those are particularly relevant in a global South perspective, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Not only assess the results, but also the procedure, the process that we have to make sure that's transparent and fair and responsible. Yeah. Yeah, Nelly, please.
I might just add, because many points were already touched upon, but I would like to add that it's very important as well that we don't see that the different types of impact are exclusive of one another. So we can have also scientific publications that will also deliver societal impact. And I think it's also important when we evaluate programs that we also give importance to what is not codified. So what is not necessarily in a publication. So I think it's also very important beyond indicators of publications, patents, etc., to also dig a lot into qualitative information, to do case studies, to talk to researchers, and also to always take also longer term perspective. So to not focus on what is easy to capture.
Okay, I hope this gives a good answer to the question that was asked. Maybe we should go over to the second question, Catherine.
Yeah, sure. We've had a live question come in that said, we've talked a lot at the conference about using metrics responsibly when assessing researchers and research proposals. What issues are there with using metrics to evaluate funding programs? And how can you be sure to collect the right data at the start when the impacts or outcomes aren't known yet?
Yeah, very good question. Also hard to answer, I guess. But I think it's very important that I think funders, when they start a funding program, they have something in mind, because it's a talent program or it's a program to foster blue sky research. And I think you have to think beforehand, what is it that we aim for? What do we mean by blue sky research? Or what, if we talk about talent, you have different stages in the career of scientists. So I think we have to make very clear what is the funding program that we aim for, what's the purpose, then decide a priori the criteria. One, to ask when is it successful and what impact do we want to achieve? And that is, I think, a necessary procedure in order to be able to evaluate whether our instrument is successful and whether we do the work correctly. So that relates both to the result of the results, the impact of the program, as well as to the procedure that was just mentioned by Erica. But it's a hard question because if you, Eriko, Bruto, I see you nodding.
No.
Yeah, Sunetja, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Stan. I think I agree. I think it is a really difficult answer, but let me just qualify that a little bit, because I actually was reflecting on this yesterday. Again, with a funder's perspective, you know, it's very easy for us to say that, you know, this is what we hope to achieve through this particular program. But the tendency that we have, and I'm going to put we, so I am overgeneralizing this, is that we put all of that information into a guideline, and we say to the applicant, we need for you to achieve all of these things through this program. And then what we have a tendency to do is to assume that only the funding is necessary to achieve those outcomes or that impact. So I think Erica made a brilliant point. If we're not considering what other ways of supporting the research or the conduct of that research needs to happen, if we don't consider that, that's not going to achieve the same outcomes. And then we apply a small and predictable set of instruments to achieve that. And then we go back, we launch the programs, and then we evaluate it. And we evaluate it using very blunt, imperfect, quantitative instruments. And as Nellie said, I would completely agree. We need to think about everything you can't measure. And that's the difficulty and I think funders are just as susceptible to this as any other institution. We're working very quickly, we're trying to make decisions very quickly, and it's very easy to go to what's ever accessible. And so we can say that we buy into these principles, but I think what I heard in this conference is, how can we move past that? And I think there's an important role for funders to really do that. And I think the ways that we think about that is kind of what I suggested in my comments, which were, rather than seeing these instruments as a way of assessing impact, that they are just one input into, the metrics are just one input into a whole range of information that you're using to figure out if your portfolio is achieving a particular outcome. And the driver for that, if parking accountability, should be learning. And so I think that's, you know, there's never going to be a reliable metric. There's never going to be a, you know, something that's going to be able to hit the nail on the head and say, this exactly was successful. It's all a feedback loop. And I think, you know, we all buy into that in principle, but I think we just all have to be self-aware and even self-critical about when we fall into the habit of just doing what's easy. And it takes a lot of work to do it the right way. And the right way meaning, as thoughtfully as Nellie just described, it takes resources and money to do it. It takes time to do it well. And I think funders need to also acknowledge that if we really want to get beyond this rhetoric and put this into practice, and we've got to start thinking about how can we learn from what we're doing, how can we build the time and the resources to really support doing it well.
Yeah, I think you're making good points, the continuous feedback on the evaluation. Because if you are looking at impact, that typically comes after the project has been completed. It can take 5, 10, 15 years, depending on what kind of research it is. And in those 10, 15 years, society is changing. So I think it's quite important to have this continuous feedback loop, you know, to evaluate continuously what is the impact and how should we measure impact in this changing society. Yeah, I think it's very important. And I think another issue is critical. I would like to collaborate with my colleague funder organizations in order to, let's say, do this this evaluation process. The Netherlands, a small country, we don't have as many programs as countries like United States and Canada. So we need data in order to have this, to update this continuous feedback and to do the learning. Brito.
Yeah, I think that Koneccia touched some very important points, and you too, Stan. I wanted to add that it's whenever we use metrics to assess impact, we have also to use prudence and caution. And we have to know from the start that metrics are not going to give us the full picture of what's going on. Metrics can complement other ways of learning about the system, about the effects of the research and so on. And it's necessary to use all that we can together. And I say that because there is a special kind of danger with metrics, which is people, researchers, non-researchers, everyone tend to fall in love with simple metrics which seem to tell things to us in one number, but they are actually not telling us anything. But when you have one single number, it's so easy to make a ranking, to order everything, to say who has the largest number, who has the smallest number. And then people enter into a discussion about nothing, actually, because it's not really meaningful. So I think we have to complexify the use of metrics and not simplify it, because reality is complex, it's not simple. So we have to use metrics together with other ways of learning.
Yeah. Nadi?
Yeah, if I may, the question was also touching to how to think about these metrics when we start a new program. Yeah. And this is something, as I was also presenting in the presentation, that is not easy to address, because we have all these policy needs that we need to address, and we need to have some information. So in our case, what we try to do is really to identify the areas in which we need information, on which it's very important. We want to have scientific, economic, societal impact, and we need to have some signals of something happening, because we will not be able to wait too long. But I think it's very important to put this in perspective with the broader work on case studies, etc., on evaluation work as well. But for us, it was very important that we had also a monitoring in place, a monitoring system in place from the beginning, to be able to capture the minimum information we need. But of course, it needs to be supplemented by other information. But yeah, we need to also realize that we need to be a bit pragmatic sometimes because of this policy request, because we are a funding organization, and we need also to be able to show that there is some progress. But we also need to manage expectations and to be clear on what we can say and cannot say, and not oversell. Okay.
Erika, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yes, I just want to make a small comment. Very interesting discussion, and I think it's again, I agree that it's a very difficult question. I will not provide a solution here, but maybe add another layer of complexity to it. Metrics, I think they are useful tools, but they also shape behavior. In other words, we have to make sure, or I think one of the complexities of utilizing, and sometimes if we use a discrete and sort of an inflexible set of metrics over time, we will perpetuate certain behaviors by those that are sort of being evaluated through those metrics, or assessed through those metrics. In other words, those that are sort of strong players may continue to do so. So in a way, there is a risk of perpetuating perhaps inequalities in the research landscape, and I think a critical question for me is how can we make sure that we utilize metrics that help us break through those sort of inequalities and provide an entry point for emerging researchers and new players who may feel at a disadvantage when measured against very established metrics that's perhaps they don't comply, even though they may have something very interesting to offer to the scientific community. So I don't have again an answer, but I think we need to give a lot of thought to metrics that allow us to provide an entry point for emerging and new players.
Okay. Well, it seems like an important topic to keep in mind when we schedule the next meetings of the Global Research Council to come back to this topic and evaluate what's going on. Okay, Catherine, maybe we should go to the next question.
Yeah, sure. This one's an interesting one. Someone has asked, how can funders and their evaluation frameworks incentivize senior academics to support PhD students and early career researchers to maximize the impact of their research and to understand what they're calling the impact game of the evaluation frameworks?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. I think it relates, in my view, to the topic of how we recognize about incentives and rewards of scientists. And I think an important topic, at least in the evaluations of at NWO, is leadership. And leadership is running a group, but also supervising PhD students, make sure that you not only talk about science, but also about a future career, whether that's in science or opportunity outside the field of science. And so in my view, being an effective leader, including the supervision and training of PhD students, is a very important topic, which is also important to be a good leader and to build a large group. Any comments on this? Yeah, Cornelia.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but I think it's a really great one. And I was thinking about this in the last discussion that we just had, and I'm hearing, kind of right now the buzz term is research culture, right? And this is what I'm hearing in this question, because our evaluation frameworks, funder evaluation frameworks, can actually include that. And so leadership, as Stan said, is one of those things. And there are other measures, how kind of community engagement, for example, and other things that Erica had described, have explicitly saying that this is something we care about, mentorship, inclusion in our evaluation frameworks, even if it's of information that we gather in terms of how this, for example, senior researcher, the question that was posed, could say that this is important because this is how the funder is evaluating not only the research outputs, but how we support and enable research and be able to support early career researchers. This is going to be important if we want to get further funding. And I think there's another opportunity again for funders to be able to contribute to that. Carlos keeps using the word system, and I think that's so important because we can't lose sight of that we funders, all of us, are part of a system, and we have to think about everything that we do has an impact on that system or affects that system. And research in of itself is a system. So I think research culture is definitely gaining a lot of prominence. It seems intangible, but there are behaviors, as Erica said, there are things that have been previously implicit that I think funders are now starting to pay attention to, and so I think we could absolutely encourage that in our frameworks. And it might be that the information that we're asking is qualitative, is evidentiary, is examples of how you, organization, senior researcher, early career researcher, are demonstrating this behavior in support of the entire research system.
Yeah. In the Netherlands, we learned that especially in large projects or consortia where we put a lot of money with many PhD student postdocs, this has become an implicit criterion for the evaluation, that we have a proper balance of gender diversity, a proper balance of young and senior researchers who work together. And especially if you talk about large projects which run for a long time, typically senior researchers might retire by the end of the program, so that it's important that you have new young scientists who can take over and take the lead in continuing this project. Brito?
Can I? Yeah, I would add that the question touches an extremely relevant point related to the reproduction and enlargement of the science system in a region, in a town, in a country. And I think that the part of the answer relates to adding the word mentoring to the word supervising. Because for a long time, professors thought about supervising their students, and they thought very little about mentoring them in their future careers, in their future opportunities, and so on. And then the question goes to how funders could incentivize better mentoring, I would translate. And I think that one particular action that funders could do is when they assess a researcher or a PI who is proposing a grant, look at not only how many PhDs or postdocs that person supervised, but what happened to those PhDs and postdocs after they left the supervision. Did they get good jobs? Did they do nice things in science? That's very seldom that is done. Most of the time, people, again, fall in love with the easiest number, how many PhDs the person graduated. So we have to complexify that, to go to where did they go to work? What good science they did after being supervised by the PI.
I think we can take one more question, Catherine, because our time is running out.
Yes, we've had another live one come in, a very small question, really. It's Erica reflected on the definition of excellence in her presentation. What specifically do you think funders could learn when defining excellence to inform their own evaluations?
Erica?
Yes, I think to answer very quickly that I think it's very important to define excellence in a contextual way. In other words, I think funding organizations should try and make efforts to set up platforms to engage with a range of stakeholders, including researchers, universities, public journals, for instance. You have a range of stakeholders that are relevant in that context, and ensure that there is a definition of excellence that responds to the need of that particular context. And I think the solution, from my point of view, it starts from there. We are doing that exercise, for instance. I mean, the NRF, for instance, in South Africa is doing a very serious exercise in terms of rethinking excellence in the context of South Africa. And I think that is an excellent approach to it.
Okay. Maybe we can have another short question, Catherine, before our time is over.
Yeah, sure. This one said, I'm just struggling to read it here. There is an established economics of education, they're saying, that looks at the return on investment in terms of human capital. Participants suggest that this return on education is much slower than return on investment with research, and asks why the panel thinks economists are not able to develop an economics of research.
Yeah, it's a good question.
I can complexify the question, not answer it.
Well, go ahead.
I would go for, it's true, it makes it slower, as the question says, the return of investment of education as compared to the return of investment of research. But I would submit that the return of investment in education tends to be higher than the return on investment on research. Research tends to be splashier. It does things and then you discover a new medicine in 3 years, or you create a company in a garage and then it's worth $1 billion and so on. But the thousands or hundreds of thousands of students that our universities educate, they change the world in ways no one can imagine. So I would add to the slower the idea of larger.
Yeah, I agree with you. And my experience is that it's hard to measure, especially in the social sciences. But in public-private partnerships, my experience is that industry wants to invest, not only because of the scientific output, but also because by investing, they train young researchers and create a knowledge base or have employers with state-of-the-art knowledge that is very important for their industry. Okay, Catherine, we are running out of time now. I think we have to stop, right?
Yes, I'm afraid so. I think we're 1 minute over.
So let me conclude by, first of all, thanking my panel members for their contribution that was broadcasted on Tuesday and the participation in the panel today. I would also like to thank all the people who are watching, participating in this video, either live or after this session. And finally, I would like to congratulate UKRI, and I'll thank them for their huge investment to organize this, these sessions. I think this is a very good preparation for the Global Research Council, which will take place hopefully next year in South Africa. So thank you very much, all of you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, colleagues.
Thank you.